Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this wonderful gathering. I followed with interest the discussion of the morning sessions about the European Union and Greece, and I have a lot of interest in the European Union. This goes back to the time of the 1990s when there was the talk about the Euro-Mediterranean relationship, the Barcelona process. At the time there was something established, a network of researchers called the Euromesco, bringing together researchers from the southern Mediterranean, I mean North African nations and Arab nations, who were members in this Barcelona process, together with European scholars, trying to develop a kind of a better understanding and enhanced cooperation between Europe and the Middle East. At that time, the people in Brussels and our European colleagues were trying to teach us the virtues and the benefits of regional integration. And Europe was very promising at the time, and I think it's still, there is a lot of potentials in Europe. We cannot just underestimate the importance of European integration. But now we are in the year 2013. The European Union is in limbo, and also the North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. So the great promises and hopes of the 1990s are no longer around. Perhaps there is a time of dismay, unfortunately. As Mr. Arsenas said this morning, that developments in the neighborhood aren't really helping handling the crisis in Greece and in Europe and in the Eurozone in the right way. Unfortunate developments happening there. Yes, definitely. This is correct. There is a major crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean neighborhood, particularly in this part used to be called and still called the Mashriq region, and this is where I will be focusing my presentation on. Peoples and the governments in the Eastern Mediterranean in a bad need for the support and help of their neighbors, of external powers, particularly of their neighbors in Europe, but unfortunately peoples and governments of Europe are busy handling their own problems. Problems here, problems there, but problems of different kinds. Problems in Europe, essentially problems of economic policy, and I think today's discussion was very rich about that. But the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean neighborhood is of a different kind. It is not a financial crisis, it is rather a crisis of the state itself. If you look around in the Eastern Mediterranean region, you will find that the majority of states there, if not all states in the region, at that point of time are suffering from different degrees of state failure, failing states of some sort. I'm sure that the scenes that you perhaps watch every day on TV about news coming from Syria definitely testify for the fact how deep the crisis of the Syrian state is. If you move a little bit to the east, to Iraq, the Syrian neighbor to the east, you will find another country that is also approaching or suffering from some sort of a state failure. The United States' attempt in state building through the policy of occupation definitely has failed, and Iraq on the verge of some sort of a civil strife. Only yesterday, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri Maliki made a speech in which he warned the opposition in his country that if they continue escalating the current political crisis in Iraq, the country is definitely, this is what he said, is approaching a civil war in which nobody is going to win. And he reminded his fellow citizens in Iraq of what's happening around in the region, in Syria and in other parts of the neighborhood, and saying that nobody wants this to be the future of Iraq. So a country that is obsessed by, preoccupied by the idea of a political deterioration or deterioration of the political situation into some sort of a civil war. We had a kind of a mini civil war in Iraq in the years, let us say, that followed the American occupation, Sunni, Shiite, etc. But there is always a concern about a renewal on a much serious level of such a kind of a civil strife or civil war. Lebanon is a country who is always on the verge of a civil war. You restore peace, yes, peace was restored to Lebanon after 15 years of civil war, 1975 to 1990, but since then there have been ups and downs, and there is in the current situation, the conflict in Syria is taking its toll on the situation in Lebanon, and we see increasing political tension between the different political parties. Actually, it's not parties, it is sects and factions, and even increasing and more frequent resorting to violence in handling political relations between the different actors. Well, if a region made up of a number of countries, the majority of them are facing a crisis of state failure, definitely the entire region in a major crisis in that regard. And the question, perhaps, or I need to spend a few minutes talking about the origin of this crisis, because it's really striking that all those states are facing that crisis of existence, if I can call them existential crisis, at that moment of time. And I would attribute that to the experience of state formation in this part of the world. The experience of state formation, the process of state formation in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Mashriq region, allowed for the formation of territorial states where territories specifically defined and allocated for them, but didn't allow for the creation of nation states, the kind of the ideal type of a state of modern times, a nation state where there is a correspondence between state institutions, state boundaries on the one hand, and the people's identity, at least the majority of the people, on the other hand. States in the Eastern Mediterranean were created lacking this kind of correspondence. And the reason, of course, I think this is the kind of a repeated lesson of history or knowledge of history, that those states were created through the political manipulation of colonial powers at the end of the First World War. The end of the First World War was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Those who were part of the Ottoman Empire, so some kind of political arrangements were needed for the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. Borders of those states were drawn essentially to demarcate the spheres of influence of the colonial powers, particularly Britain and France at that time. This made very much sense for and looked like a kind of rational policy for the colonial powers themselves, but for the people of the region, those newly created states didn't really make much sense. It looked for them a kind of an arbitrary creations that didn't really match anything serious in reality. And in two particular dimensions, the crisis of those states was quite manifest. On the one hand, in most of those states, actually, maybe except Lebanon, there wasn't really any serious, genuine local demand for statehood in those countries. There was no demand for the state of Iraq or a state called Syria or Lebanon, small Lebanon, Mount Lebanon being expanded, etc. But Jordan definitely wasn't there. So there was no any local demand for such a kind of political entity. But all of a sudden, in a morning, in a shiny morning, people woke up and they live in a state that they didn't really request or anything. And on the other hand, yes, on the other hand, the lack of correspondence between the identity of the people and the state borders. People were either associate more with a smaller entities, tribal, ethnic, etc., or broader entities, pan-Arab, pan-Islamic things. But those particular nation state or territorial state weren't really something that people felt affiliated with. So this is those states, however, have survived now for almost 90 years. But now this is apparently the time of crisis. Apparently that they've been able to survive for the past 90 years. This survival is somewhat coming to an end or to a major test. International system helped to maintain, to consolidate those states, particularly during the Cold War time. But with the international system of globalization, states in the region are facing tremendous challenges, actually, that apparently they are no longer able to deal with. I'm trying to move fast a little bit. But if we want to, I would identify 4 dynamics in particular that put those states in crisis during this world of globalization. The first one is a challenge to the state sovereignty. Remember, those states are fragile. Their sovereignty are challenged by their own people from the very beginning because of this lack of correspondence between identity and borders. And now you have international systems that put in question the state sovereignty itself. You have international systems that generate demand for human rights and democracy, something that goes against the regime, the nature of regimes there, authoritarian regime that been able to maintain, to survive and maintain their states by oppression. Now with the demand for democracy and human rights, well, this is no longer something that looks like working. Communication technology is a third dynamic that allowed and facilitated people's ability to mobilize against governments and further expose governments to continue using the same tactics of authoritarianism that they used to have. And fourthly, in the current world, governments in the region denied many of the sources, the rent system, the rent sources, the assistance that been able to collect for strategic reasons from the Soviets, from the Americans in the past. So they are forced to go into some sort of like economic structure, the policy of structural adjustments that caused a lot of dislocations within those countries and made more people ready or have reason to mobilize and to join the opposition in those governments. The region is definitely known with a very strong spillover effects, conflicts moving from one country to another. And perhaps the crisis now in Syria is very central, and it's the outcome of this crisis is likely to affect the rest of the region in different ways. Particularly the countries of Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan are very vulnerable in that regard. Here in Europe, and particularly in this part of Europe, perhaps the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean will be felt through the five effects, at least. One of them is the refugees and illegal migration, and perhaps large number of people now are fleeing those zones of conflict and will go around seeking refuge in other places, and Greece and other European countries in the neighborhood, and perhaps you will receive more refugees and illegal immigrants. There will be increased demand for humanitarian assistance that can be difficult to deny. Terrorism is likely to happen. I think it's well known that among the active political groupings in many of those countries, including Syria, some of the very fanatic Islamist groups associated with Al-Qaeda, perhaps you're familiar with Jabhat al-Nusra, this organization that the Americans put on the list of like terrorist organization, very active on the ground in Syria. Organized crime is likely also to be at some increasing pressure, cause increasing pressure here in this part of Europe, and definitely there is a greater likelihood of having an impact on the energy supplies coming from the Middle East, because again the crisis is happening in a region that is that has a kind of dimensions in the Gulf, the Bahrain issue, the Iranian issue. etc. So there is a possibility of impact on the energy market. If I have a minute, just a minute, 1 minute, okay. Just to policy alternatives addressing this crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean. One alternative is the work to achieve deep reforms while maintaining the current state system in the region. Some sort of like orderly political change. Of course, talking about orderly change now while civil war is happening in Syria is something is contradictory in terms, in a sense. But remember, Syria is one country. There are other countries who are likely to be hit by this crisis. If there is an effort to contain the impact of the Syrian crisis in those nations by achieving some sort of orderly reform in those countries to maintain the state system in the region, this is one alternative, and definitely this alternative will need a very active role from third parties, Europeans and Americans. Hopefully Europe can be effective in that regard. Well, a second alternative is just accept the reality that states there reach the date of expiration and thus allow for the creation of new states, states in which people identity match the borders. Well, this is a kind of a scary scenario, but there is a demand for different states now. Kurds, Shiite, Sunni, etc. People who are no longer satisfied with being just Iraqis or Syrians, or so they just demand their own nation state. And this is at a time where people are empowered, at a time where states are collapsing. Why not? It is how for that to be achieved with the minimum damage and with the minimum pain. This is we can talk about that. The third alternative is just focus on maintaining the security and survival of some key states. And here I'm in particular just pointing at Jordan. This is a very key state, very vulnerable on the one hand, but on the other hand, if it is to fail, we will see much further and serious consequences to Europe and to the rest of the region. The fourth alternative is just do nothing and just focus on humanitarian assistance, just trying to reduce the suffering of some sort of like spontaneous developments that have local driving forces that will perhaps make him keep going for a number of years. The crisis that we see now in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in Syria, I think this is just the beginning. Perhaps things will get worse. This is a bad news. But we, at least if we know that, we have to be ready. Thank you.